Welcome to the Nemours Champions for Children podcast. I'm Carol Vassar. We're joined again this time around by Dr. Lana Gordon, an adolescent medicine specialist based in Jacksonville, Florida. And we're talking about her lived experience as a young Black female physician and how those combined experiences, negative and positive, have motivated her to become part of Nemours Drive initiative.
The idea of kind of diversity and equity and anti-racism and value inclusion, those are all things that are just very near and dear to me for a variety of reasons. One, just kind of from my personal lived experience as a Black woman who's also young and frequently doesn't meet what other people's expectation is initially of what a doctor should be. As a person who needs healthcare myself and, sometimes experiences things that show sometimes people's bias in healthcare. Very largely, adolescent medicine focuses on marginalized populations. And so in some ways, adolescents are a marginalized group within pediatrics. And then a lot of the specific disease states that we care for are kind of marginalized within medicine. So it's a lived experience of a lot of my patients. And then I think finally, just, I was really excited about the fact that Nemours had taken the step of wanting to be an anti-racist organization. And so I definitely wanted to be a part of that process, a part of the solution, part of building that infrastructure there. And, it had become a professional interest of mine, actually, as I was transitioning jobs. That was something that I was very involved in my last job. And so I was looking for a way to kind of continue that work. So I was really excited that that was something that I could continue here.
Continuing that effort here is derived for her from personal and professional lived experience. Like that moment in the role of a patient making a routine phone call to a doctor's office.
I was calling to make an appointment for my pulmonologist's office. And I'm an established patient there. I've gone there for a while. Love the doctor that I go to. And I called to make an appointment. They were having some trouble. They apparently were switching electronic medical records. And so when I called to make my appointment, they explained to me that they've been making some changes. So they were going to need to get some additional insurance information from me again. I said, okay, no problem. Let me go grab my card. Now I recognize, I was making this call. I have some off time due to kind of having evening clinic. So, I was calling like 10 o'clock in the morning on a weekday. So I get it. I was doing dishes or whatever. So I'm sure that they maybe heard some of that noise in the background and went and grabbed my purse. So I was like, what do you need off the card? And they were like, oh, we're going to need your ID number. It's probably written underneath the little part of it, on the card. And for whatever reason, I guess she decided that my insurance number did not sound like what she thought was going to be the insurance number. And she said to me, yeah, can you read those numbers again? So I said, okay, no problem. And I started again. And then she was like, wait, is this Medicaid? And I said, no, it's not Medicaid. She's like, well, what insurance do you have? And I said, Aetna. And she said, like the Aetna Medicaid plan? And I said, no, Aetna from a private employer. I remember just being just a little shocked because I was just kind of like, what on earth? And I remember thinking for a little while, what on earth possessed her to assume that I had Medicaid? And the only thing I could think of was that day in the week. It's not first thing in the morning. I clearly didn't sound like I was at a place of employment. I clearly sounded like I was home, which I was, I mean, and, she had asked me for other demographic information. So she had my race, she had my date of birth, she had these other pieces of information. And so I don't know, I guess the best thing that she could have come up with for someone who, was a Black woman who is approaching middle age, I guess, to be at home. Was that I must have Medicaid. And I was just kind of like, no, I don't have Medicaid. I thought it was interesting because I actually laughed because I was like, yep, they definitely changed over their medical file because what I knew was their electronic system was that I know that previously the EMR had me flagged as a doctor. So I was like, well, I suppose they are right. They did completely change over their system and all of the information is gone.
You're able to laugh about it, but yeah, it's one of those, I guess, would that be considered a microaggression right there?
I mean, right. I mean, that would be what kind of, would be used and classified as a microaggression. But, as I've kind of been reading and reflecting a lot on Ibram Kendi's, book on how to be an anti-racist, I do like that he kind of points out that, microaggressions aren't really micro. They are aggressions. They are things that happen and that, they do have stings. There was a little meme that I saw, or not meme, but like a little short video that I saw, I can't remember who put it out, that talked about them being like mosquito bites. One mosquito bite by itself won't kill you usually. But, a mosquito bite is irritating. It just adds some discomfort to your day. And the discomfort from it isn't just in the moment. It kind of lingers for a while. And so definitely, yeah, I was just kind of like, oh, it really made me spend some time thinking about it. When I went to the doctor's office, a few weeks later, I definitely thought about it again. Like, I can't say I thought about it much past that first day, but I definitely pulled back up in the parking lot. And there was a piece of me that was just kind of like, so what exactly, led someone to think this about me? And as I sat in the waiting room and looked around, it did make me stop and think, well, what are people assuming about myself in comparison to other people in the waiting room? It's not a practice that I think I assume takes a lot of Medicaid, just based on what I casually see. It's a pretty large medical group, so I assume they take all insurances, but most of the patients in the waiting room are elderly, as I guess you would expect at a pulmonologist's office. And, I was just kind of like, I assume most of them probably have Medicare of some sort. But so I was just, I really did spend some time as I was sitting in the waiting room, like, I wonder what exactly led whoever it was that answered the phone to think that about me. There's a part of me that's like, well, this is an experience and it's negative. There are other parts of me that recognize that, unfortunately, this is just a part of life. It's the expectation that, people will double check in ways that you're not thinking about.
As an adolescent medicine physician, Dr. Gordon works closely with people who make up the so-called Generation Z, that cohort of children born in the U.S. starting in 1997, according to the Pew Research Center. And she gives Gen Z high marks for their ability to address and even expect diversity and inclusion.
There's so much more savvy and thinking about these things in a much more, I think, sophisticated and nuanced way. It's a part of their world. They expect diversity to be something that's included. What's interesting to me is that they're engaged in wanting to have these conversations. They think about these perspectives as they come into the exam room and as they're thinking about the questions that you ask them, how they interact with them, and what they want. I think that overall, my patients really enjoy having, a youngish Black doctor. That's a woman. I think that they like that. I think they want me to bring that part of myself into the exam room. But, their parents are of a different generation. Some of their parents are close to me in age, and some of their parents are a little older than me.
And sometimes they come with their grandparents, who may or may not be using inclusive language. This was the case with one patient and the grandmother who accompanied that patient to see Dr. Gordon about an already sensitive personal topic centered on puberty.
Before the visit, she and her granddaughter had been having a conversation about whether or not they had met me at the hospital before. And, the granddaughter was pretty insistent that she didn't think that she had met me. And the grandmother thought that she had. And when I walk into the room, I'm like, hi, I'm Dr. Gordon. And she goes, oh, yeah, I know. I never met you before. And I was just like, oh, okay.
Oh.
Well, pleasure to meet you. Yeah, I don't believe, we've ever been acquainted. I didn't see, any record that, I've seen your child before. What's going on? And we kind of start conversing, and she just still was like, yeah, no. And she looks at her daughter and she says, oh, I know I didn't meet her before. She was like, she's a real nice looking colored lady. I know I would have remembered if I met a nice looking colored lady before.
Oh, she said that?
Yeah. And so her granddaughter looks mortified, and she's like, Grandma. She was like, they're not colored anymore. And she's like, they're African American. And the grandmother is just like, I don't mean any harm by it. Like, she was like, when I was growing up, they were colored. It's not a mean word. Like, they're colored. Like, she's like, I didn't call her anything bad. I didn't call her the N-word. Like, I know you don't call people that. Like, whatever. And I was like, okay. So what was interesting was that I had a trainee with me. So the trainee is watching this and is very off-put by the situation. Apparently, she had made a comment to, I guess, my staff before. So my MA had heard this and was kind of in her mind, like, she didn't say anything to me initially because she was hoping that the patient wasn't like that they weren't going to say anything, and she didn't know what to say. And I recognize that there's a part of me that wants to address the idea of, like, why does it matter? But then also recognizing that the patient is actually the person who is centered in this visit. And she is already extremely embarrassed by her grandmother's behavior. And so now we're going to have a conversation around something that could be difficult to talk about. And I don't want there in the patient's mind to be a feeling that there's any harshness or animosity between me and her grandmother, because I don't want her to not tell me something or to feel bothered by the situation because She thinks that me and her grandmother have friction or that I'm offended by her grandmother. And then also, I'm going to ask her grandmother to step out of the room at some point and leave her child alone with me. And so there are all of these dynamics there. And so I recognize that while there were many things that I could have said that maybe, and I don't think they would have been mean or, unprofessional or any of those things, that was not the right moment for that. And so, I frequently say, because I do a lot of diversity work with the residents as a part of one of my roles here at Nemours. I direct the diversity and equity and inclusion programming for graduate medical education. I frequently say that one of the things that is important for all of us to recognize, particularly when we have positions of privilege, is that not everything that you could say or could do, should you say or do. So a lot of times as doctors, we have a lot of authority of what we could tell people, what we could tell them that they have to do, what we could tell them that we are or are not going to do. But to recognize that at the end of, or on the other side, because a lot of times the behavior that is undesired that's being directed towards us is not being directed by the patient, it's being directed by a caregiver. And recognizing that being able to diffuse situations with caregivers is extremely important, because at the end of the day, there's a patient who is frequently very blameless in whatever the interpersonal dynamic is. And so in that particular situation, I just chose to disregard the comment all the way to the end of the visit, where she thanked me for being a very nice colored doctor. And so the only thing that I can take away from that scenario is that perhaps from that situation, she had the realization that maybe the experience of what she expected with a doctor who is a person of color was not what she experienced, because I do think that she had a good experience. I think it was a positive experience. I have seen the patient since then, though not with the grandmother. So there was at least enough of a positive experience for them to desire to return. And so there was something about expectations that were not met, and it seems like it was positive. One of the things that we pride ourselves at Nemours about doing is wanting to exceed expectations. And one of the things that I was very involved in my other job was thinking about how patient satisfaction surveys impact people who are members of marginalized groups. The example that I frequently use is thinking about how women, with the expectation of when you're going to get an engagement ring. So there comes a point in time in any relationship where you are pretty certain that you're close to getting engaged, and the people around you are definitely certain that you're close to getting engaged. And you might have a special day coming up, a birthday, a Christmas, a New Year's, whatever. And, there's the expectation that since something nice is like you're going out on a nice date, and that perhaps, this is the moment you're going to become engaged. And if your expectation walking into that date is that you're going to get engaged, it's a possibility. And, your loved one pulls out a box and it's jewelry. If there is anything in that jewelry box other than an engagement ring, you are disappointed. It could be a nice sapphire ring. It could be the most beautiful, pendant or whatever that you could imagine in life. It could be keys to a brand new car. It could be, a trip you've always wanted to go on. But because your expectation was to get engaged, your expectations were not met, and you were therefore disappointed. In the converse, that person could have pulled out a box, and if it has an engagement ring in it, and it's an engagement ring made of cubic zirconia instead, there may be some excitement, and your expectations may be met, because the engagement ring represents the fact that you're going to get married, and that was your expectation. So similarly, I think for experiences when people come to the doctor, they have an expectation of who a doctor is, what a doctor looks like. And there could be times where a person gets really exceptional care, but because it was not delivered by a person that they expected to get care from, that package was not what they were expecting. Their expectations were not met. And so it doesn't matter how nice or how receptive or how, explanatory the doctor was. That survey is not going to say that their expectations were exceeded, because the experience just wasn't what you were looking for. On the flip side, you can see somebody who is a doctor who honestly didn't provide exceptional service. They were running late. They didn't spend a lot of time. They were dismissive. They were directive in their conversation. But the delivery person was someone who met your expectations of what a doctor should be. And so therefore, your expectations were met, and you check a survey a different way. And I think that one of the things that we haven't really thought through as a profession, both internally facing or externally facing, is how do we have those conversations about what does it mean? What are the expectations for healthcare? And what does it mean when the delivery isn't what people expect? And how do we all react to that? And I can think of many encounters I've had where people have expressed some kind of bias, either directly or more in a micro way, towards me as a provider. But I can't say it was always my race. Can't always say it was my gender. Can't always say it was my age. But what I do know is that the package of someone who is young, a woman, Black, that is not what has been marketed as a doctor. And for some people, that is too much. It may have been okay if I was a woman. It may have been okay if I was Black. It may have been okay if I was young. But all three,
But that's who you are. And that's what makes you who you are, and the exceptional care that you provide, package notwithstanding. So much to ask. The trainee who was in the room with you, how did you, after this situation was done, this appointment was over and the patient and grandmother had left, how did you use that as a teaching moment? I'm assuming you did.
Yeah. So, I mean, we left, and I think it probably would have been forgotten about if the patient didn't because our visits are long, if the patient hadn't or the parent hadn't kind of brought it back up again at the end. So, I kind of left the room, went to tell staff, kind of stuff I need to do. And I kind of chuckled, and kind of mentioned the commentary, to which they were like, oh yeah, she said that to me when we walked in, when I first walked in, and I didn't say anything because I was just kind of hopefully she's gotten it out of her system. So they were like, well, what'd you do? And I said, the interaction was good. I said, I truly do believe that grandma did not mean it did not mean colored in a derogatory way. She truly meant it as that's what she learned that Black people were called. And she didn't mean anything disrespectful by it. And so I said, that was why, I decided that in the moment it was not relevant to correct, because it wasn't. I said, now, if she had used something that was a derogatory term, or I felt it was a derogatory term, I would have said to her, that's actually not a term that I prefer to use to refer to myself. I tend to prefer to use this term or that term. It's the same thing with patients who, for instance, will refuse to call you doctor because you're a woman, which happens on occasion. I've walked in, is it Miss or Mrs.? Is it Miss or Mrs.? And I'm like, it's doctor. Right, but is it Mr. or Mrs.? And I said, well, my marital status isn't actually relevant in the discourse of today. I usually try to deflect with a little bit of humor. So I'll usually kind of say, gosh, I paid so much money for these little letters in front of my name, and so I like to use them on occasion. Sometimes that, will correct the situation. Some people will, then explain to you that they don't actually mean any disrespect by it. And say, look, I understand that. Just for me, it is a source of great pride. But more importantly, it's important in the context of medicine to know who saw you and who you were seen by. And so that's part of why that title is there, is because not everybody that you can see that asks questions and does things of that nature is a physician. And it's helpful to know that the person you saw was a physician.
Now, you mentioned that you also do this kind of DEI work with medical students, graduate students. Is that something that you had training in when you were in medical school, or is this relatively new?
So I would say it's a relatively new thing. I think that the idea of teaching cultural competence has been a part of medical education probably since at least the 70s. But I think, it has taken on many different forms. And so, in the iteration that we're trying to teach right now to our trainees here is, we're trying to teach the concept of cultural humility. And so the idea that, I think the form of cultural competence education I got recognized that people were diverse, but really focused on equality. And then also focused on, I would say, stereotypes. So wanting to understand different groups, but kind of perpetuating a lot of stereotypes. So, Black people might be distrustful of healthcare because of the Tuskegee experiment. Asians frequently are taught to avoid making eye contact, so you shouldn't be offended if they don't make eye contact with you. Cupping and coining is a cultural practice that's considered alternative medicine. It's not child abuse. Hispanics believe in the malo, things like that, which I think that those are nice little nuggets. But the problem is that every Hispanic person doesn't believe in malo. Every African American isn't going to decide that they don't want a medical treatment purely because of the Tuskegee experiment. And so if that's the only toolkit that facts about people that may or may not be true based on what you assume about them based on how you see them, their paint job, as I like to call it, that's not necessarily accurate. And so I think that a lot of our trainees received probably in their training something that thought a little bit more about equity rather than equality. So each person should get what they need to get to whatever benchmark is that we have. And then also thinking through what I like to call food festivals and fun. So a lot of DEI work kind of thinks through, okay, it's Pride Month. Okay, it's African American History Month. Okay, it's Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. It's Hispanic Heritage Month. It's whatever. And so let's learn what the holiday is, learn what people do on the holiday, and let's try some food. I think that the challenge with that lens is that it's better than just some snippet facts that don't apply to everyone, but it still is trying to categorize people. And again, I think the thing that Zennials teach me the most is that people don't like to be categorized, and that categories aren't as neat as we think they are. And so when I think about, for instance, my Blackness, how much of my Blackness is a result of living in America and being raised in America? How much of my Blackness is the result of having two Jamaican parents? I have my own culture that is separate from my parents' culture, that is also separate and maybe from the dominant African American culture in the US, particularly in the South. There's regional difference even within that. But while there are a lot of things that are kind of shared experiences of a child of West Indian heritage, there's also a lot of shared experiences that really reflect being the child of an immigrant. So I have a lot of things that I identify that I'm more similar with into other people that I know who are first generation from wherever, than maybe even other people who are Black. But then where you lived. So when I did fellowship in New York, and pretty much all of my co-fellows were first generation. That just happened to be the cohort of people that were there at the same time that I was. Our parents were from many different places. But one of the things that I recognized was that some of my experiences were very much shaped by what does it mean to be first generation in a suburban area that doesn't have a lot of diversity around immigration. So my experiences and my identity were very similar to my co-fellow who was Indian American and grew up in Danbury, Connecticut, in comparison to another co-fellow who was of Trinidadian heritage, but grew up in New York City. If you're somebody who grew up in the 80s in New York City with Trinidadian parents, especially if you grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, you actually didn't feel like a minority. But when you're a girl who has Jamaican parents who grew up in Jacksonville, Florida in the 1980s, you very much feel othered in that sense, and by a lot of different people. And so there was a lot more similarity in my Indian American co-fellows experience growing up in America than there was with my Trinidadian American co-fellows experience. And that was just purely because of demographics of where we lived. I think that those themes are important. And so one of the things that I'm working on with our trainees is really thinking about what shapes our identity. What are the different parts of that? What parts of our identity give us privilege? What parts of our identity make us feel othered or we think of as liabilities? And how do we bring that to the experience that we're having with our patients? But then also, what do our patients think about us when they see us? Because I've benefited from assumptions. So I've had patients who have wanted to see me or have told me things because when they saw my Black skin, they thought that I had had an experience that was very similar to theirs and that I would be able to identify. And truthfully, I haven't had experiences that are similar to them that allow me to identify. And I've actually had trainees or other staff members who don't have skin that looks like theirs that actually have closer experiences and would probably be able to provide better help. But there's the projection of what people assume when they see you. And sometimes that's an advantage for you, and sometimes it's a disadvantage. But if you have the humility as you approach a situation to say, tell me more about that. I'm not sure I understand that. Let me see if I'm what I'm hearing. Then if you have the right tools, then regardless of who the person is that presents to you, you'll have the keys to navigate maybe what is the missing piece of information to hopefully provide a better piece of care and a better, more humanistic form of care that respects the cultural differences and identities.
I want to go back to the Zennials. You talk about the Zennials accepting diversity, not seeing so much the divisions in the world. Is that where our true hope lies in many ways?
I think so. I mean, I'd like to correct the idea that they don't see the divisions in the world. I think they see the divisions in the world. I think that instead they don't view the divisions in the world as a problem. And so I saw a beautiful quote, I like quotes, that said that childhood ends the moment that you see a puddle as an obstacle rather than an opportunity. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's my hope for the Zennials, is that I see Zennials as people who see the diversity, the differences in each of us as an opportunity and not an obstacle. And I think that maybe a lot of us enter this world starting in that place. But somewhere along the process of life, of trying to build whatever it is that we need, we start to see our differences. We start to see the things that separate us as exactly that, separations. We don't see them as opportunities. And so what my hope is that Zennials have the option of always seeing the differences as opportunities. I appreciate their decision or their intentionality that you don't have to choose. If you think about it, the fight of kind of pride initially was to be able to love who you loved and to be able to identify and live your true self. And then Zennial said, why do I have to be in a box? I could love multiple people. I could love traits about someone who happens to identify in this way, and then love those same traits in someone else who identifies in this other way. I could also see myself as a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but not squarely in either camp, which is a radical thought even for me as a millennial. It takes moments for me to wrap my mind around that and say, okay, yeah. My hope is that we'll keep that as they move into the progressive, part of their career and of their life, and as they become the influencers or shapers of the world, and that they'll also continue to teach the generations behind them this same thought process and, of course, expand on it. But I always want us to think through what is the strength of our diversity. I always want us to challenge how can we be more anti whatever the ism is of the day, because I think as long as there is humanity, there will always be people who will have more power than other people. And the people who have more power will always want to try to see how they can capitalize on it, because that's human. That's a part of being human. But I hope that there will always be the effort to say, no, that, just because I am different from you and someone has said that this is more valuable, this difference is more valuable, does not mean that I should have more power than you. I hope that we will always think about ways that we can include people who are not like us and include diversity in thought and opinion and experience. I hope that we will always think about how do we get the best value for our patients. And I hope that we'll always think about how to be equitable. And so I don't want us to ever lose the view of Drive or the lens of Drive. But I do hope that the challenge or what we're working on in the moment feels like small potatoes.
I like it.
I guess the only other thing I would say is just that I don't want any of the associates to think that Drive is just about the people who are on kind of the enterprise level committee or the work groups, but to recognize that Drive is a part of what each of us do. And so whether you carry a title or you're just an associate, that each of us should be thinking about in each and every day, how is it that what we do at Nemours can be evaluated through the lens of Drive, and what could we do better in that sense? So it's the work of all of us.
Dr. Lana Gordon is an adolescent medicine specialist based in Jacksonville, Florida. Well, that's it for this week's podcast. Thank you to Dr. Lana Gordon for sharing her time with us. As for the podcast, we do welcome your feedback and ideas. All you have to do is email us, podcast@nemours.org. That's podcast@nemours.org. Deborah Griffin and Peter Adebi, thanks as always for your production assistance. The Champions for Children podcast is available on Nemours Net and the Nemours Now app, and you may subscribe to the podcast today on your favorite podcast app or listen on your favorite smart speaker. Our music is courtesy of Blue Dot Sessions in Turners Falls, Massachusetts. On behalf of Dr. Lana Gordon, I'm Carol Vassar. Thanks for joining us on this edition of the Nemours Champions for Children podcast. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and thank you for all you do for the children and families we serve.